In the winter of 1799, 5 surveyors entered the Appalachian wilderness to map out a new trade route. They were men of measurement and routine, marking trees, recording directions, and sleeping under stone ledges as the cold got deeper. But soon the forest grew too quiet. Their compass started acting strange. Voices began calling from the dark, familiar voices that should not have been there. By the time they realized something was following them, the mountains had already closed in behind them. So before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I entered the mountains in late November of 1799 with a survey chain across my shoulder and frost under my boots. Our party had 5 people. Ephraim Cutter, who knew the ridge lines from trading journeys, walked ahead with a hickory staff. Mr. Biss kept the field book and compass. Jonas Reed carried paper, inks, and a folding rule for sketching the cuts and hollows. Silas Pike, younger than the rest, packed traps and a short rifle he bragged about in a steady way that annoyed us by the second day. I came on behalf of the land company out of Staunton to mark a wagon road through the high country. Their path from the Piedmont farms to the river valleys beyond the Blue Range. The company promised a fair payment and a share in a lot if I brought back a route that would not break wagons or oxen. That promise warmed me more than the fire most nights. The first miles rose through oak trees that had shed their leaves. The ground was covered in rust-colored leaves that softened each step. Cold held the air still. Our breath hung in front of us when we paused to check the compass. Laurel thickets blocked every side path. The land tilted and folded in ways that forced us to zigzag and stagger. I marked each change in direction, while Jonas sketched the slope and the chutes of quartz that cut across the path. We kept a steady pace because daylight ended early, and the cold pressed hard on our hands at dusk. We slept the first night under a rock overhang with a wet seam along its back wall. Ephraim kept the fire small to save wood. He handed out a pinch of salt pork and hard bread. Pike tried to snare rabbits by the creek and came back empty. His jaw was set and his rifle was clean, which made me doubt his stories about bears and panthers on every hill. My mind went to my father's warnings about winter work in unknown country. I kept them to myself because a road would not draw itself, and every man there depended on the rest. On the second day, the trail narrowed to a hogback ridge where wind hit our ears through our caps. We used the staff to steady ourselves along icy patches. Between stands of pine, the valleys opened in gray bands. The world looked stripped to bone and stone. We did not hear birds. Even the crows that follow camps were absent. I told myself the wind pushed sound away. Jonas noticed the same and set his jaw without words. It put a weight on us that the cold had not. Near noon, we dropped into a hollow to avoid a cliff face and found a set of piles made from flat stones. Each stack stood knee-high, 5 in a line, each separated by a few paces. No soot, no ash, no sign of cooking. The stones were clean. Ephraim walked around them once with his hands behind his back. He said no settler would waste time on that, and no hunter would bother. Biss drew them in the field book and wrote a number next to the sketch. We left them untouched. I did not like the way the water in the creek ran clear around them, and yet smelled of iron in that one stretch. I kept that to myself for the time being. By late day, we came to a saddle where the wind died. We made camp at a sheltered bend of a small stream. It carried thin ice along its edges that cracked in a pattern as steady as a heartbeat. Pike went downstream to set a trap for muskrat. Jonas warmed his hands and drew out the day's route by the firelight. I chewed bread and counted the chain links to set my mind on something orderly. From far off, a sound reached us that reminded me of a child calling to be found. I had not heard any family in these hills for 2 days. The sound came again. Not the same pitch, not the same distance. It did not carry through the trees the way a real voice would. Biss looked at me and I saw he wanted me to judge it. I said it could be a fox. That was true enough at times of year, though the sound had a shape to it that raised the hair at the back of my neck. We built up the fire. Ephraim took first watch and sat with his back to a boulder. The sound did not return. When my turn came, the stars were hard points above the pines, and the ground glowed dull red through the coals. A rabbit came into the edge of the light, stopped and bolted without reason I could see. I thought of the stone piles and felt a wrongness I could not place on a map. I held my tongue because fear spreads faster than a flame on dry bark, and we had work to do. The next morning, we found Pike's trap empty and moved on before the sun cleared the ridge. We crossed places where the leaf cover grew shallow and the soil below turned slick. In a muddy patch at the edge of a seep, we saw impressions I did not know. They were not hoof prints. They were not a bear's pads. Each mark showed a palm with long finger shapes pressed ahead of it. Clawless but sharp at the tips, spread wide as a man's hand. The stride between them was longer than my leg. The marks ran from the laurel into the wet moss and vanished on rock. Ephraim crouched over them without speaking, then rose and walked on. Pike said it must be an odd bear. His voice wavered when he said it. No one answered him. We pushed east along a new direction and met no other sign until midday. That was when Jonas called us over to a peeled birch. At shoulder height, the bark showed 4 deep dents spaced neat and parallel, set into the white in a way that made me think of the marks on a scratchboard. The wood had not bled long. The chips lay at the base with a faint green look that fresh cuts have. Biss measured the spacing with his rule. He did not write down the numbers. I saw his mouth move as if he counted twice in his head, and then he put the rule away. We stopped early near a spring, more for our nerves than for any sound reason. The air smelled of damp stone and crushed fern. I set the stakes on the day's line while Jonas boiled a thin stew. Pike walked a ring around us and came back quiet, which was new for him. He set his rifle across his lap and kept looking down slope. After dark, the call came again. It drifted through the trees with a tone that copied a word without carrying it. Then it changed and made a sound that echoed Biss's cough from that morning. My scalp tightened. Ephraim's head turned slowly, and he raised a finger to his lips. We sat silent until the fire burned low. I lay awake and counted my breaths. The calls moved around the ridge, never close enough to locate, never far enough to forget. At one point I heard a rustle and the crack of a small branch. The urge to rise and chase after it came strong, and for a moment I nearly stood. Something in me pulled the thought apart and left it bare. I kept still. A cold draft ran through camp and set the canvas edge flapping. I looked across the coals at the others. Jonas's eyes watched me. He knew I had almost made the wrong choice. Morning light showed a smear of mud on the far side of our firestone. 4 finger marks cut through the ash and stopped inches from my bedroll. No track led to it or away. The marks had been placed, not stepped, as if a hand rested there to test us. My stomach turned. I scraped the ash flat with a stick and said nothing beyond the need to move. We made for a known pass that Ephraim said would open to a gentler slope beyond. The climb came steep and punishing. By midday, my shoulders burned from the chain and the pack straps. Trees thinned to scrub. On the last pitch, we found bones scattered under a ledge. They were not arranged. The skull of a deer lay split along the crown in a straight line. Not a crack from a fall. The rib ends were clipped clean. No tooth marks. No gnawing. Marrow had been taken without breaking the length of the bones. I stared at it and tried to think of a tool that would do that without dulling or slipping. I could not. We did not rest there. We gained the pass and set our line down the eastern side. The wind rose and pushed clouds across the ridge tops. Shadows moved in ways that made it hard to judge the depth of the gullies. The quiet held. I wished for the sound of a jay's scream or a woodpecker's call. We found neither. Near a stunted pine, we came across a scrap of cloth caught on a branch. It had once been blue. It was worn thin and had a brown stain along one edge. It looked old but not rotted. No camp lay near. No ashes, no cut stump. I took the cloth and put it in my bag. I did not know whether it belonged to a family that lost their way or a trapper who had no reason to tear his coat on a tree that low. At dusk, we reached a narrow bench with a view over a dark valley. We set the fire low again and ate in quiet. The calls began before full dark, closer than the night before. First the child's cry, then a man's cough, then a broken word that could have been help. Ephraim did not flinch. He set a second fire 10 paces from the first and spread coals around both, so the light spread across the ground. It made the shadows shallow and left no edge deep enough to hide a whole body. I saw then that he had a plan he had used before. It steadied me and made me angry in the same breath, because he had not told us sooner. I asked him under the noise what he knew. He said only that certain hollows kept to themselves. Man listened to voices where none should be. He could not count on the morning. He told me to sleep in turns and to keep a stick within reach. He did not say why a stick would matter more than iron. I understood it on the second watch when the wind shifted and a stench came over the camp, a mix of old meat and wet soil that hit hard at the back of the throat. I heard steps then, light and fast, circling faster than any man could without stumbling. My skin prickled. I gripped the stick and watched the edge of the light. I did not call out. I did not shoot. I waited and kept count of the circles with my breath until they stopped. At first light, we checked the ground beyond the spread of the coals. The leaf cover showed nothing. A few stones lay in short lines that none of us had set, 5 in one line, 3 in another, each laid edge to edge. Jonas crouched and touched one with a knuckle. It felt deliberate. We took them up and set them aside without comment. The meat bag had been opened and tied again, not in the knot Pike used. A strip of pork was missing. No tracks, no drag marks. The cord had a new kink at the turn that I did not recognize. We broke camp in a hurry. Ephraim set a direction that would carry us along the hillside instead of up and over. He said we would go around the valley and reach a connecting ridge that led east to a lower pass. I agreed because cutting across, the slope would keep us off the benches and away from the drains. We moved in a line with a short space between each man. Biss kept the compass close and checked it more often than he needed. Jonas stopped drawing and walked with his head up, ready to take notes only when I told him. Pike asked twice if we should double back. No one answered him the second time. 2 hours into the walk, we found a tree with a mark on the trunk at my shoulder height. It showed 4 dents in a neat row, same spacing as before. The bark chips were dry on the ground. That meant we were not chasing a single place. Something moved along with us. I took out my knife and cut a new mark next to the dents to fix the spot for the map. I do not know why I wanted that mark there. It felt like a way to put our hand on the country and not be driven by it. By midday, the slope broke into boulders and short drops. We had to hand pack down and cut steps into a damp clay face with the staff. When we reached the bottom of that pitch, Pike pointed to a flat patch under a laurel cluster. There lay a piece of metal from a trap spring, cracked clean through. The break showed bright steel. The spring had not rusted. He picked it up and turned it in his palm. He had not set a trap there. None of us had. He slid the piece into his pocket and said nothing. We ate without fire. Cold bread, a few mouthfuls of pork, a swallow of water each. The wood stayed empty of bird calls. A small moth fluttered out of a rotted log and disappeared. That was the only living thing we saw besides ourselves. While we chewed, a voice called my name from beyond a screen of rhododendron. It matched my mother's tone from 20 years before. It used a word she had used for me when I took a fever. I stood without meaning to and took one step. Ephraim's hand closed on my sleeve and held me. He did not speak. The voice used the same word again with the same rhythm. It had no breath in it between syllables. I sat. The voice stopped. We rose and moved. An hour later, we reached a run of limestone outcrops that formed a broken wall. The rock had shallow shelves and dark holes. One opening lay lower than the others and showed a flattened entry. The soil there was packed hard. No leaves gathered in it. A pale hair lay across the entry stone, finer than any horsehair, long and nearly see-through. I touched it and felt a slight stickiness to it, like skin that has dried in cold air. It clung to my glove. I rubbed it away on the rock and wished I had not touched it. We passed on without looking inside. The day bent toward evening. The sky opened in a narrow stripe above the ridge and then closed. I set a pace to reach a stand of spruce that would break the wind. We came into that stand and found an old fire ring half buried in needles with 3 blackened stones and a green birch pole balanced across 2 forked sticks. Someone had used it to hang a pot not long ago. The pole had not yet softened. A length of twine hung from it with a knot like the one on our meat bag. We searched around the area. No tools, no bones, no prints. I did not like the way the ground felt underfoot, firm and springless, almost like a floor. I said we should move on and sleep elsewhere. No one argued. Dark came before we cleared the spruce. We had to stop in a narrow cut with a stream at our feet and rock on both sides. We set 2 fires again with space between them. Ephraim gave us each a green limb to hold. He told us to keep the ends wet and to strike the ground with them if anything came close. He said the sound would carry and confuse a fast approach. He spoke plainly and without strain. It steadied me. Pike said he would rather fire a shot. Ephraim told him a shot would not find what he could not see. The first call came at full dark from upslope. A man's voice called here, then it called over. Then it sounded like Biss saying this way in the exact tone he had used on the ridge at noon. Biss's face drained of color. He gripped the compass until his knuckles showed in the firelight. Jonas whispered that we should fix the direction of the sound with a compass reading and leave a mark. I shook my head. There was no fixed direction. The next call came from downstream. It used a child's sob that broke once and then stopped without a breath. Pike stood, rifle in hand. I told him to sit. He did not. The next part moved fast. A pale shape flicked across the gap between the 2 fires and landed beyond the second circle of light. It kept to 4 points. The body was long and starved. The head rose and turned toward us. The eyes were large and took the light with a flat look that showed no shine back. It held there for a breath and slipped away with no sound but a dry scrape on rock. Pike fired at the movement. The shot struck. A tree splintered bark and blew smoke into our faces. The sound ran up the hollow and back on us in a dull echo. The thing did not cry out, it did not stumble, it did not leave a mark. Pike swung to reload. His hands worked slower than they should have. I watched the gap and saw a hand reach into the edge of the light, palm down. Fingers long and bony, nails like horn without a point. It flexed and withdrew. Ephraim lifted his green limb and struck the ground 3 times in a steady beat. We followed him with our own. The wet leaves slapped and left a dull sound that filled the hollow. The call stopped for a count of 20. Nothing moved. Then stones landed around us one by one, each about the size of a thumb. They fell from above the fires and no arc showed. They landed near our feet and at the edge of our blankets. One struck my shoulder with a sting. Another hit Jonas's hat and knocked it sideways. The pattern made no sense you could track. I felt anger rise in me at the cheap, hurting way of it. I kept silent and struck the ground again. The stones stopped. A low noise followed, less a growl than a thin press of air through a throat. It came from 3 places in short order. I had the thought that there was more than one. I did not say it because saying it would make Pike run. He was shaking. He knelt and tried to pour powder without spilling. Ephraim slid the powder horn from his hand and capped it. He told Pike to hold the branch with both hands and to keep his eyes on the space between the fires. Pike nodded and obeyed. That obedience saved him in the next moment when a pale form slid into the narrowest part of the gap on its belly with a speed that did not match the ground. Pike struck downward with the branch by reflex. The tip landed on a wrist and made a hollow crack. The hand jerked back and vanished. The branch end came up wet, not with blood, with a thin, clear fluid that smelled of copper and stone. It dried fast on the bark and left a faint crust. The quiet that followed pressed in a new way, not empty but waiting. We held our places until the coal sank and the flames dropped. The cold settled. I told them we would not sleep. We would wait through until light. We kept the rhythm of the branches, not constant, not regular, but often enough to break any rush. Twice more we saw a flicker at the edge of the light. A shoulder or a knee, a head at a low angle that a man would not use. No full form, no cry. Just that low air sound and the shift of pale skin along ground. Dawn came slow and grey. When the trees showed their first outline, we looked around at the ground outside the fires. The dirt and leaves held marks everywhere. Not prints you could cast, but places where weight had pressed and then lifted in clean lifts that left no drag. The marks ran in lines that crossed and doubled back. Each line ended before a stone or a log. No scuff on the obstacle, no mark on the far side. I took a length of cord from my bag and stretched it along one line. The span between the points fell into a pattern every 6 or 7 paces. That was not random movement. We packed with care. Pike had not slept. His face looked raw and young. He asked to turn back. Ephraim said no. He said the ground behind us would not be cleaner than the ground ahead. He told us the only way was the low pass and the river beyond. He told Pike he could walk in the middle and keep the branch ready. Pike swallowed and nodded. That choice hardened something in him that had been soft since we left the town. Biss said we should leave a notice for any who followed. I wrote a short note on a scrap of Jonas's paper. Do not camp in the spruce stand with the old ring. Keep 2 fires. Do not answer voices. I wedged it under a stone in the open where a man's eye would travel. It felt like a small act, but it steadied me to do it. We moved again. The country beyond the hollow narrowed into a rocky throat where a creek cut through ledges and short drops. We had to step from stone to stone. The marks on the banks stayed with us. Always ahead, never behind. Twice we came to places where the laurel had been bent back at knee height, holding its curve with no broken stems. Something had gone through low with a smooth motion. In one muddy pocket, we found one clear palm with the long fingers pressed deep. At the heel of the hand, a small chip of pale skin lay half buried. I lifted it on the tip of my knife. It curled when the air hit it, and then stiffened. I knocked it off and covered it with wet moss. By late morning, we reached a slab of rock that formed a shallow cave at the base of a cliff. The floor inside showed packed earth and a trace of that copperstone odor. In the back wall, a narrow crack led deeper. It was not wide enough for a man on hands and knees, but it was more than a rat hole. The crack had smears on the edges where something had passed many times. Seifrim looked at it and then at me. He said we should not block it. He said we would not win a blocking. He said we would keep moving and avoid any place with a crack like that. He spoke with the tone you use when the rule is final. We left the cave and angled to the right to climb a spur that would take us out of that throat. Halfway up, the calls began again, and this time they used our own words from the night before, matched to each man's voice and rhythm, placed just ahead of us. Hold the branch, it said in Pike's voice. Do not shoot, it said in Ephraim's. Do not mark it, it said in mine. The effect pulled at the mind in a way that felt like a hand moving your chin. Pike gritted his teeth and kept climbing. Jonas whispered a prayer under his breath to keep his thoughts from leaning after the words. I counted steps each time a call came and did not let my feet match the rhythm. We reached the spur top and found a deadfall of pine trunks. Recent, all down in one direction. The needles were still green. No wind had done it. The trunks had been scraped along the lower bark. Not gnawed by teeth, but rasped. The wood under the bark had a pattern of parallel scrapes, spaced like the dents in the birch. The ends of the branches were piled in a short fence at knee height, with an opening in the middle just wide enough for a man. Beyond the opening, the ground dipped out of sight. Ephraim said we would not pass through that gap. He led us along the top of the deadfall instead, stepping on the main trunks. The wood held. The space below looked wrong, too clean of branches as if cleared. I kept my eyes ahead. At the far end, we climbed down and pushed through a narrow screen of saplings. We came into a small flat basin ringed by rock. In the center stood a single standing stone, not natural to that spot. It had been carried there. It stood taller than a man. On its face, 4 vertical grooves ran from head height to knee. The grooves were deep and clean. Around the base lay small stones in 2 rings, 5 in the inner, 8 in the outer, each placed with a space the width of a hand. No wind had set them. No child had played there. The air smelled cold and bare. My tongue felt dry. No one spoke. We backed out the way we came and did not turn our backs on the stone until the saplings hid it. When the trees closed around us again, I felt a single clear thought settle in me. We were being moved, not chased. Moved. I looked at Ephraim. He knew it. He set his jaw and changed the direction one more time to cut straight for the low pass without going around any side paths, even if it cost us strength. He said we would either break the pattern or it would close. He said we would see which before dark. I believed him and felt the hours tighten ahead of us. We began the descent with no rest. The slope was steep and covered with loose rock that shifted under each step. I kept the chain slung over my shoulder to free my hands. The air grew colder, and the smell of the ground changed from pine to wet earth and clay. Our boots sank deep enough to leave clean holes that filled slowly with water. No birds followed. The only sounds were our breathing and the creak of leather. Ephraim kept us close, no more than 2 paces between men. He stopped often to listen, not with his head turned, but with his whole body still, shoulders lifted slightly. Each time he paused, the forest seemed to match him, as if everything waited on the same count. Then he'd move again and we'd follow. We reached a narrow creek lined with hemlock. The trunks leaned in, roots gripping stone. The water ran thin but quick, cutting a dark line through the soil. It made a steady sound that covered our own noise. For a moment it felt safe. Biss knelt to fill his canteen. He looked at me and nodded toward the far bank. I followed his gaze and saw a single footprint at the edge of the water pressed into the mud. It showed the same long palm and finger marks as before, but this one was deeper, almost a hand's depth. The fingers had pressed so hard that the mud had split along the tips. The print pointed toward us. Pike swore under his breath. He reached for his rifle. Ephraim told him to keep walking. I saw Pike's lip tremble before he caught it between his teeth. We crossed the creek one by one, stepping on flat stones. Jonas slipped and caught himself on a root. The water came up past his ankle. When he climbed out, his boot left a dark trail that faded in seconds. The mud seemed to draw back into itself, erasing his print. That was the first moment I felt sure that the ground itself had turned against us. As the ridge opened, the light changed. The sun sat behind thin clouds, dull and colorless, but the forest seemed darker than before. The trunks stood closer together, the bark dry and smooth like skin stretched tight. I heard no wind, yet the branches moved with small tremors. Ephraim turned once and said quietly, "Don't look long at anything that moves without sound." He did not explain. We obeyed. By mid-afternoon, we came to a shelf of rock that hung over a deep gully. A narrow game trail ran along its edge. I went first with the staff for balance. Halfway across, I caught the faintest smell, metallic and stale, the same scent that came with the clear fluid on Pike's branch. It grew stronger the farther we went. When we reached the other side, the odor had thickened into something that stayed in the throat. The gully below was full of broken branches, stripped of bark and color. They were arranged in lines that met at sharp angles, like ribs laid in a pattern. Some still had green needles, but no stumps showed where they'd been cut. It looked as though they had been taken from the forest and placed there by hand. Jonas turned pale. He said it looked like a nest. Ephraim told him not to say that word again. We didn't. We pushed on until we reached a narrow gap between 2 cliffs. It was the only way forward. The space was just wide enough for one man at a time. I went after Ephraim. The air between the rocks was colder, the kind of cold that doesn't touch the skin but sits inside the chest. Halfway through, I heard a sound behind us, short, wet, and close. A scrape on stone followed, like something dragging its hand along the wall. I turned my head, but saw only the other's shadow stretched by the dim light. Pike whispered my name. I told him to keep moving. The scrape followed us through and stopped the moment we stepped out on the other side. The valley beyond was long and low, with a shallow stream winding through it. The water reflected the sky in dull gray patches. The far slope led toward the pass we needed. Relief came to me for the first time in days. It lasted only until I saw the trees at the far edge. Their lower trunks were pale, not from bark, but from something smeared over them. When we came closer, I realized it was a mix of clay and ash pressed into the bark by hand. The streaks ran upward in long swipes, each ending with a faint fingertip impression. The pattern followed a rhythm. 5 marks. Pause. 4 marks. Pause. 5 again. It ran across 20 trees in a straight line. We stopped. Ephraim studied it and said it was not a warning we would understand. He led us around it. We walked in silence, each man's breath the only proof he was still near. The ground softened underfoot. I realized we had entered a low marsh. Mud bubbled up around our boots. The stream widened here and spread thin across the flat. A few cattails bent in the windless air. The smell of iron came back stronger. Then Biss stopped and pointed. Something pale moved beneath the surface of the water. At first I thought it was a log. Then it turned, and I saw the outline of a shoulder and a long, hairless arm. It glided along the bottom of the stream with slow, steady motion, stirring no ripple. The head turned slightly toward us. Its eyes caught the faint light, and showed a dull grey shine. It held there for a breath and sank again, with a movement so smooth I could not tell where the body ended. It disappeared into the deeper part of the marsh. We stood frozen. I could hear Pike breathing fast through his teeth. Jonas's lips moved soundlessly. The cold in my chest turned sharp. I felt the weight of the mountains around us, the same way a man feels the weight of water when he's gone too deep. Ephraim finally said, "Keep walking, don't stop until you see dry ground." We followed him, stepping carefully to avoid splashing. Every few yards the mud pulled harder, as if the ground didn't want to release us. When we reached a patch of higher soil, I looked back. The surface of the water was still. Then, just as we turned away, a ripple spread across it, wide and slow, as though something large had risen beneath. We didn't wait to see what it was. We made camp that night on a flat rise beside a stand of birch. We built no fire. Ephraim said the light had begun to draw it. We ate cold bread and meat in silence. The dark came down heavy, pressing against the edge of sight. I could hear movement out in the marsh, faint splashes that stopped whenever I turned my head. Once a sound like a hand striking mud came from the far side of the rise. Pike gripped his rifle tighter. Then we heard a voice again, mine. It called from somewhere downslope saying, "Here." "Over here." The tone was exact. The same rhythm, the same breath between words. It came again louder. "Here." I froze. The others stared at me. Jonas whispered that it sounded right. Bish shook his head. Ephraim picked up a small stone and threw it in the direction of the voice. It hit the ground with a dull thud. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. After a long moment, another voice came, this time Biss's. It was calling the same phrase, but it sounded further off. The two voices began trading calls. One close, one far, each copying the other. The pattern set my teeth on edge. I saw fear settle in every man's eyes. Ephraim motioned us to move closer together. We sat back to back, rifles ready, branches at our feet. The calls continued until sometime past midnight, then fell silent all at once. I must have dozed for a short time because when I opened my eyes, the world had gone quiet. The moon hung low and pale behind a thin cloud. Something moved between the trunks ahead. I squinted and saw it crouched at the edge of the trees, tall, bent forward, pale skin stretched tight over ribs. It rested one hand on the ground and tilted its head slowly as if listening. Its eyes caught the faint moonlight but reflected nothing. Its mouth hung open slightly. I saw no teeth, only darkness. It stayed there for several breaths, then moved on all fours toward us. Ephraim lifted his hand and whispered, "Stay down." The thing stopped 10 paces from us. Its head turned toward Pike. It sniffed the air. Pike's finger hovered near the trigger. I wanted to stop him but couldn't speak. The creature's arm stretched out long enough that it could almost touch the edge of Pike's boot. Then it pulled back, rose slowly until it stood half upright. Bones shifted under the skin in ways that didn't look possible. It made a sound, a low, thin exhale that carried no tone. The smell of rot and cold stone filled the air. Ephraim threw a handful of dirt into the fire pit, where no flame burned. The motion broke the stillness. The creature turned sharply and vanished into the trees with a movement faster than I could track. Branches swayed once and went still. We stayed frozen until dawn. When light came, the ground around the camp was disturbed. Clear tracks this time, handprints and knee marks circling us in tight loops. The soil where it had stood near Pike's boot was pressed flat, and in the center of that mark lay a single fragment of something like skin. Curled and dry, Ephraim picked it up with a stick, looked at it once and flicked it away into the woods. He said, "It knows we're leaving." We packed quickly and started for the pass. The trees thinned. Wind reached us again. For the first time in days, I heard a bird, a distant crow calling from the ridge ahead. It gave me hope, but Ephraim's expression stayed grim. He said nothing until the path opened to a broad slope leading down to the valley. Then he said, "Don't look back." We didn't. But as we descended, I felt something watching from the tree line, silent and close. We walked faster. And when the wind shifted, I thought I heard my own voice whisper my name. We reached the lower valley by late morning. The trees grew taller there, spaced wider apart, and sunlight touched the ground for the first time in days. I felt warmth on my face and believed for a moment that the worst had passed. We moved along a slope covered in leaf litter, that crunched beneath our boots. An ordinary sound that felt almost foreign now. Ephraim paused to check the compass and looked back only once. His eyes traced the line of the ridge behind us, then dropped to the ground. "Keep your heads forward," he said. "We'll be clear before sundown." The valley narrowed again after a mile. The stream we followed twisted through rock and formed shallow pools that reflected the sky. Biss checked his field book, trying to match the shape of the land to our last recorded directions. He frowned and said the slope angles were wrong. The compass spun slightly, not fast, but enough to make him curse under his breath. He tapped the case with a finger, shook it once, and said the needle was sticking. I knew that was not the reason. The same kind of iron that gave the air its smell was pulling at it. I told him to mark north by the sun and trust his eye. Jonas walked beside me, quiet. He hadn't drawn in 2 days. His hands shook when he tried to hold a pencil. He said he kept seeing movement in the corners of his vision, thin figures darting from tree to tree. I told him it was his mind catching shapes in the light, but I didn't believe my own words. Pike had stopped talking altogether. He walked behind us, eyes darting to every sound. The rifle held across his chest. Each time a branch cracked, he jerked his head toward it. The ground softened again near a bend in the stream. We found tracks there, ours from the day before, pressed deep into the mud. Only we had never crossed this place before. Ephraim studied them a long time. They followed the water upstream and vanished under the bank, where the creek cut sharp into clay. He traced one print with his finger and said quietly, "These are fresh." I leaned closer. They were perfect impressions of our boots. Every nail, every worn edge. Mine were there, Biss's smaller ones, even Pike's with the notch by the heel. But the stride was wrong. Each print stretched longer, as if whoever made them had longer legs or walked with a jump. Jonas whispered that we had come in a circle. Ephraim shook his head. "It's not us," he said, and turned upstream. We followed the creek until the water began to deepen. The walls of the valley grew higher, and sunlight thinned until only a pale glow filtered through the canopy. The air turned still. A sound began behind us, faint at first, branches brushing together in uneven rhythm. Not wind, steps, multiple, slow and deliberate. We stopped. The sound stopped too. I looked at Ephraim. He raised his hand and pointed forward. "Keep moving," he said. "Don't answer to what follows." The sound returned once we started walking again, matching our pace exactly. I tried to test it by quickening my step. It quickened too. When I slowed, it did the same. The echo never fell out of rhythm. It followed us for nearly a mile before fading away. We didn't stop until we reached a rise where the valley split into 2 narrow paths. Ephraim chose the left path without hesitation. I asked why. He said, "The right one smells wrong." That was enough for all of us. The path tightened to a passage barely wide enough for 2 men. The light dimmed and the cold returned. When we came out on the other side, the land opened into a hollow with tall grass and a line of dead trees in the center. The trees had no bark. Their wood was gray, dry, and smooth. At their base lay bones, deer, fox, and smaller things I couldn't name. Each bone was clean as though boiled. Some were stacked in pairs, one across another, and a few had been arranged into narrow rows that pointed toward the far slope. Jonas counted them under his breath until I told him to stop. Biss covered his mouth with his sleeve and looked away. Pike crouched near one of the piles and lifted a skull. It was small, maybe a rabbit's, but the top had been crushed flat by something that didn't leave teeth marks. He dropped it quickly. Ephraim said, "Keep your hands off anything that's been touched." His voice shook slightly for the first time. We went around the hollow and started up the slope. The ground rose toward the pass. I felt the air change again, lighter, moving, carrying sound. The wind had returned, bringing the scent of pine and cold rock. For the first time in days, I believed we were near the edge of those cursed hills. The idea brought a quiet strength to my steps. Pike whispered, "Once we see the ridge line, I'm done with this land." No one disagreed. Then, near the top, we found something that stopped us cold. A man's coat hung from a low branch. The fabric was stiff, half frozen, the color long faded to brown. The sleeves were empty, the seams torn. Under it lay a boot, still laced with a fragment of bone inside. Ephraim crouched and touched the coat. The branch it hung on had grown around the collar, as if it had been there for years. Yet the leather was not rotted. He looked up at the slope ahead and his face turned pale. "We've come through here before," he said quietly. "That's my mark." I followed his gaze. On a nearby stone was a single carved line, short and straight. The same kind of mark Ephraim had cut days earlier when we found the first tree marks. The same knife work, the same depth. The truth sank in slowly. We had not been moving forward. The land itself had folded around us. Biss muttered, "It's turning us." Ephraim rose and spoke low but firm. "Then we break its pattern. We don't follow the creek or the ridge. We go east straight through whatever comes." His words steadied us because they gave direction, even if it was madness. We adjusted our packs and turned into the trees. The woods grew thick and uneven. The soil hardened underfoot, then softened again in patches that sank deep as a man's knee. The smell of iron returned, strong enough to sting the nose. After an hour, the ground began to tilt downward, and we saw glimpses of open ground through the trunks. Ephraim quickened his pace. "That's the pass," he said. "We're almost clear." Then a sound rose from behind. A long, steady howl. Not animal, not human. It vibrated through the air like the ground itself was groaning. Jonas clapped his hands to his ears. Biss stumbled. I felt it in my ribs. It stopped, then came again. Closer, drawn out into a low pitch that broke at the end like a voice trying to speak. Pike fired his rifle blindly into the trees. The shot cracked and echoed, and then the woods went silent. When the echo died, I heard something move through the brush below us, fast, heavy, circling. I saw a flash of white between the trees, then another. Ephraim shouted for us to run. We broke into a sprint down the slope. Branches tore at our clothes. The ground fell away faster than I could control. I nearly lost my footing, but kept moving. Behind me came the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but a rush like a body sliding just above the ground. Jonas cried out once. I turned in time to see him fall. His pack tangled in a root. Something pale moved past him and vanished into the trees. He screamed again. Then the sound cut off sharp. I started toward him, but Ephraim pulled me forward. "He's gone," he said, voice raw. "Keep running." We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest. The trees broke open to a wide stretch of rock and low scrub. The air smelled clean again. My lungs burned. Biss stumbled beside me, gasping. Pike came last, rifle gone. Both hands shaking, Ephraim looked behind us. The tree line was still. No sound followed. For the first time in days, we could see the sky clear above us. We stood there breathing hard, staring back at the darkness between the trunks. The silence of it was unbearable. Then from that silence came a sound. A voice that matched Jonas's perfectly. It called out our names, calm and clear, the way a man calls when he's found his footing. It said, "This way." None of us moved. The voice came again, softer now. "Please," Ephraim whispered, "don't look." We turned away from the trees and began to cross the open ground toward the ridge. I didn't look back, but I felt the air shift behind us as though something large had stepped into the light for the first time in years. We reached the ridge by dusk. The land ahead sloped gently down into open forest, and through the haze I could make out the faint silver of a river twisting between the hills. Ephraim said it was the Kanawha. None of us spoke for several minutes. The sight of it filled us with a quiet that wasn't peace. We'd survived, but the world behind us had turned strange. And the thought of it still there, alive in the dark, set my teeth on edge. We built a small fire for warmth hidden behind a rock shelf. Ephraim said it was safe now. The air felt clean and the silence no longer held that waiting edge. Pike sat apart from us, staring at the ground. He hadn't spoken since the chase. His hands trembled and his eyes darted toward the trees whenever a twig snapped. Biss opened the field book and tried to write, but his fingers shook too badly. He closed it again and tucked it away. The pages were damp with sweat. I asked Ephraim if he believed we were free of it. He took a long time to answer. "Free of the hills," he said finally, "not of the thing that lives in them." He stirred the fire with a stick. "It's older than these woods. It keeps what enters its ground. We just walked out by chance." I wanted to believe that, but my mind would not settle. I could still smell the faint tang of metal on the wind. The air moved, yet every few moments it paused, only for a breath, and the world went completely still before stirring again. It was the same rhythm I'd heard in the valley when it circled us at night. I didn't tell the others. Some truths once spoken set roots. We ate in silence. The food tasted dry. Biss suggested we move through the night and follow the river to the nearest settlement. Ephraim shook his head. "Not in the dark," he said. "That's how it calls men back." So we stayed. One man awake at all times. I took the second watch. The stars were sharp and bright above the ridge. The fire had burned low, giving little light. I watched the edge of the woods below. For hours nothing moved. Then I heard a sound that was almost human, like a man clearing his throat. Once, low, deliberate. It came from far off down the slope. I turned to wake Ephraim, but when I looked back, the sound had stopped. At dawn, we broke camp. Pike looked worse than ever. His eyes bloodshot. His skin pale and grey. He moved stiffly like an old man. Ephraim offered to take his pack, but Pike refused. "I can manage," he said. His voice cracked halfway through the words. We started down the ridge in single file, following the stream toward the river. The forest lightened as the sun rose. Birds returned. First one call, then another, until the woods sounded alive again. For the first time, I believed we were back in a world that made sense. I even caught myself breathing easier. But halfway down the ridge, I noticed something strange. Pike's boots left no print. The ground was soft, damp from dew, yet the soil where he stepped stayed untouched. I watched him longer. Each time his foot came down, the leaves didn't shift. It was as if the earth no longer felt him. "Ephraim," I said quietly, pointing. Ephraim looked, then stopped walking. Pike turned and stared at us both, confused. "What?" he said. His face looked thinner than it had that morning. The skin stretched across his cheekbones. Ephraim stepped closer. "Take off your glove," he said. Pike hesitated. "Why?" "Take it off." Pike slowly peeled the glove from his left hand. The skin beneath was pale, almost white, with a faint bluish color. The veins had darkened to gray. When he flexed his fingers, the joints made a dry sound. He stared at his hand like it wasn't his own. "It's the cold," he said, but his voice trembled. Ephraim reached forward, grabbed Pike's wrist, and pressed his thumb against it. After a moment, he let go. "No pulse," he said quietly. Pike stepped back. "That's not possible." He pressed his other hand to his chest, breathing fast. "I can feel my heart." He looked terrified now, shaking his head. "You're wrong." He turned as if to walk away, but stumbled, catching himself on a tree. The bark blackened where he touched it. Just a faint mark at first, but real. Biss took a step forward, but Ephraim held out an arm to stop him. "Stay back." Pike sank to his knees, clutching his chest. His breathing slowed. For a long moment, he was still, staring at the ground. Then he looked up at us. His eyes were glassy, his mouth half open. "It's calling me," he said. His voice had changed, flat, hollow, with an echo I couldn't place. He stood, unsteady, and took one step toward the trees. Ephraim raised his rifle. "Stop right there, Pike." Pike looked at him, and for an instant he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. "You can't stop it," he said. And before any of us could move, he turned and ran into the woods. Ephraim fired once. The shot cracked through the trees, scattering birds into the air. We ran after him, pushing through brush and branches. The forest ahead opened into a small clearing. Pike stood in the center of it, facing away from us, perfectly still. His shirt was torn. His skin looked almost see-through in the sunlight. I shouted his name. He turned slowly, and I saw his eyes. Pale gray, unfocused, without pupils. His mouth moved, but no sound came. Then he dropped to the ground. We approached carefully. Ephraim rolled him over with the barrel of his rifle. Pike's chest wasn't moving. His eyes were open, staring at the sky. The skin on his arms had turned cold and stiff. There was no blood, no wound. Biss knelt beside him and whispered a prayer. I closed Pike's eyes. We stood there in silence, unsure what we were looking at. The body was empty of life, yet it didn't look dead. Not entirely. Ephraim said we would bury him there. We used our knives and hands to dig a shallow grave beneath a birch. The soil came up wet and dark. We covered him with stones and branches, not saying much. When we finished, Ephraim pulled a scrap of paper from Biss's field book and wrote a few words before placing it under a rock. He didn't tell us what he'd written. We left the clearing and continued toward the river. The forest thinned further, and the sound of running water grew louder. The land felt different now, lighter, but my thoughts stayed heavy. I kept seeing Pike's face, the color of ash, his mouth forming that silent word. I didn't know if it was a plea or something else entirely. By evening, we reached the riverbank. The water was high from melted snow, moving fast and cold. Across it, smoke rose from chimneys. A small settlement, cabins, fields, livestock, human life. We stood watching it as if we couldn't believe it was real. Ephraim smiled faintly for the first time. "We made it," he said. We crossed through a shallow spot where the rocks broke the current. My legs went numb from the cold, but I didn't care. On the far side, 2 men came running from the cabins, rifles raised until they saw our faces. They greeted us with confusion and helped us to shore. We told them little, only that we'd lost a man in the hills. One of the locals brought blankets and bread. I tried to eat but couldn't. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night they gave us a place to sleep inside a barn. The smell of hay and smoke filled the air. It should have been comforting, but I couldn't rest. Near midnight I heard movement outside, soft, measured steps circling the barn. I told myself it was one of the settlers checking the animals. But then I heard a faint scrape along the wall. I rose quietly and looked through a gap in the boards. The field was empty except for mist drifting from the river. Then from the far fence line, something pale moved on all fours just outside the reach of moonlight. It stopped once, lifted its head, and turned toward the barn. I saw a glint, 2 eyes, gray and unblinking. Then it dropped low and slipped into the fog. I backed away from the wall, heart pounding. Ephraim was already awake, watching me. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He just said, "It doesn't stay in the hills. It follows what escapes." We left at first light, heading east toward the main road. None of us looked back. That was 20 years ago. I never returned to those mountains, though I've heard of men who did and didn't come back. They say there are old ruins deep in those woods now. Stone circles overgrown with roots. Hunters speak of pale shapes that move without sound. Some nights when the wind carries from the west, I hear a faint cry that sounds almost like a man calling my name. And when it stops, the silence feels exactly like it did in those hills.